Hey, Stewart's Chapel, this is Brother Don Pierson and Don Counts, and we're at Thumper and Allie's home, and this is Monday's devotion. I want to take you to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. Beloved, I beg you, as sojourners, in other words, as those who are just passing through, and pilgrims, in other words, this is not your home, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of God's visitation. How you live can silence the voice of those who do not have a clue about whose you are. I want to tell a story about at least two men. One was Kedar. Kedar was my translator in Gaza. Kedar's sister had converted to Christianity from Islam, and when she had, Kedar and the rest of his family beat her. I mean, they beat her, and they disowned her, and they threw her out into the streets of Gaza. The believers there who had helped her come to know Christ took her in. About 2 years after that event, Kedar had over and again had run into his sister, but he never saw her sad. She was always joyful. There was something about her that caught his attention. Everything in him during that 2 years felt like he had been betrayed by her, that she had disowned their family and not them her. And so even though he was aware of her heart and the joy, it bothered him. And then one day after 2 years, he encountered his sister again. And he asked her, "Why are you so happy?" And she told him about Jesus. Well, that seed that she planted into his life began to grow. God watered it, God made it grow, and he too began to fall in love with Jesus. He gave his life to the Lord. He did the same thing as his sister did. He told his parents, and they did the same thing to him. His family beat him, disowned him, and threw him into the streets of Gaza. His sister took him in. He was just a young man when I met him, just in his early 20s when I met him. It hadn't been that long since he had become a Christian. And the Christian church in Gaza, that small group of 50, all of them basically had the same kind of experience. I was deeply moved by Kedar. His strength, as we would go into Muslim homes and they would know what he had done, he would translate for me. His boldness, his strength of faith, it was obvious to me, and it was obvious to the Muslims that were in the homes of. He knew that the world that he was living in was not his home. The other man is, I will call Joseph. I don't know how to pronounce his real name. I don't even know what his real name is. I've always called him Joseph. I was doing a conference in Tennessee, in Sparta, Tennessee, at Bear Cove Baptist Church. It was an Baptist associational event, and I had to come in to bring a message. But I wasn't the only one on the program. And there was another man on the program. And again, I can't tell you his name, but I'll call him Joseph. Joseph was on that program. Before the service that night, they had a covered dish meal, a time of fellowship and eating. And Joseph sat in front of me. Joseph and I visited some. He was from India, and his English was actually very good. It was a little broken, but it was still very, very good, much better than my Spanish. And I listened to him and we talked, but we really didn't share much story. The whole time I'm sitting there, I know you could not help but notice that his face was scarred, and that one of his arms, and it's been so long now I can't remember, that one of his arms was dead, was limp. It had no power to it. As we left the meal time, me and Joseph walked in together, following the associational leader, and which was Steve Ferris. It's amazing how sometimes you can remember something, other times you can't. Steve Ferris ushered us in, and we sat down in the front pew. He gave us a bulletin or order of the worship service. And so they had their singing, and I'm looking at the order, and I see that Joseph is down to share his testimony before I preach. Oh my goodness. Great time of worship. Joseph gets up, very quietly and humbly. He tells his story. A story about how, when he came to become a Christian, his family had been the village priest of, I want to say it was Hinduism, but it could have been, I'm not sure what was the religion of his village, but it wasn't Christianity. But he and his family had always been the village priest. Their job was to maintain the temple and to keep it cleaned out from all the vegetables and fruit sacrifice that would be brought, and to keep the gods alive. In this case, what I appeared was God, and it may not have been their God, but cobras. Cobras were part of their worship and that experience, at least by what I understood. Anyway, when Joseph became a Christian, and he told his father and his family dragged him to the temple, and they stoned him. They stoned him. They stoned and beat him. And then they dragged him outside of the village and just left him for dead. Well, Joseph wasn't dead, but he was smart enough to know, I better not go back in that village or they'll finish it. So he traveled to the next village, or to a place where he could find some other Christians. And he found some. And for several years they cared for him and took care of him. But the burden for his father and for his family and for his village would not go away. One day, after several years, after he is healed, even though his arm is still dead from the abuse and his face shows the scar, he made a trip back to his village on a mission to tell the same people that had tried to kill him that Jesus was the one and only God. Well, he did that. And this time they listened to him. Probably because there was just something about him. The Spirit of God shone through him. Here was a man that they had tried to kill and could not kill. And he's there again, telling them the same thing. Their hearts are different, and the Holy Spirit works. And many in that village, including his own family, become Christians. Now, you know how Joseph made it to Sparta, Tennessee? This association had sent a team to India. Steve Ferris had led it. They had gone and they had built a Baptist church in Joseph's village, where Joseph was the minister. They heard the story from those who had stoned him. They wanted Joseph to come and share his story. We become so attached to this world as American Christians, we forget that we're just passing through. This is not our home. Our roots are deep. The truth is, I don't know how deep the roots of the world are in us. So much so that we don't know anything at all about suffering. We know very little about loyalty. We know very little about endurance, and we know very little about shining in the midst of persecution. The two men I shared with you are Kedar and Joseph. But my brothers and sisters, the rest of the world is filled with men and women like that. That's a faith and endurance that most of us don't know much about. May this and the testimony of these two and the millions that are behind them burn in us the next time we complain because something just doesn't go right for us or our kids or our ways. I love you, Stewart's Chapel, but God is calling us to something greater than just going to church.